I never imagined my life would change over something as simple as a grocery bag. It was a Friday evening, and Emily, my wife of 12 years, was bustling around the kitchen, unpacking the shopping she'd done earlier that day. The kids were upstairs, giggling about God knows what, and I was nursing a beer on the couch, flipping channels and not paying much attention to anything in particular. Then I heard it, a faint, muffled clang that didn't belong. It came from one of the bags Emily had just dropped on the counter. She froze for just a second before recovering and continuing to unload the groceries. It was subtle, but I caught it. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she reached into the bag. Curious, I leaned over and called out, "What's that noise?" "Nothing," she replied too quickly, her voice higher than usual. "Just a jar of pasta sauce that tipped over." It didn't sound like glass, though. More like metal. Instinct told me not to let it go. I got up, stretching as if I were just meandering into the kitchen, and reached into the bag she had pushed furthest away. That's when I found it, a box of condoms, glaring at me like an accusation. We hadn't used condoms in years. My stomach tightened as I turned to her, holding up the box. "What's this, Emily?" She stared at me, wide-eyed, her face a mix of shock and panic. For a moment, I thought she might faint. Instead, she stammered, those aren't mine. They must have been mixed in with the groceries by mistake." "Mixed in with the groceries? Really?" I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. But in that moment, I kept my cool. I simply placed the box on the counter, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Let's not do this." "Who are they for?" Emily froze, staring at the box like it might explode if she moved. I could see her mind racing, her face shifting between denial and panic. For years, I had admired how quick she was under pressure, a trait that served her well in her career. But now, watching her scramble for an explanation, all I felt was cold detachment. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting. "Jason," she said finally, her voice low and urgent, like we were co-conspirators in some secret, "you're overreacting. I don't know how those got in there. Maybe someone at the store. I don't know." She trailed off, the words hanging awkwardly between us. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The silence did the work for me. She hated silence, always had. It made her nervous, forced her to fill it. Her next words came in a rush. "Fine. They're Sarah's," she blurted out, naming her closest friend. "She asked me to pick them up for her. She's been too embarrassed to buy them herself." "Sarah's in another state," I replied evenly. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't accusing. I was just stating facts, and I could see it unraveling her. "Well, she's visiting next week." Emily snapped, her tone defensive now. "I was just getting them ahead of time." "Right. Because Sarah, who's 35 and married, is too embarrassed to buy her own condoms, so she called you from 3 states away to pick some up a week in advance." "Makes perfect sense." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For a moment, I thought she might laugh at how ridiculous her story was, admit to whatever was going on, and we could finally talk. Instead, she did what I've seen people do when cornered in a lie: they double down. "You're being insane," she shouted, snatching the box off the counter and shoving it into a drawer. "Why are you even questioning me like this? Do you not trust me?" Trust? The word hit me harder than it should have. For years, trust had been the backbone of our relationship. I thought we could survive anything because of it. But now, standing in that kitchen, I realized I hadn't truly trusted her in months. Maybe longer. "Let's not make this about me, Emily," I said quietly. "I asked you a simple question. Whose are they?" She stared at me, her eyes narrowing. I could almost see her calculating the odds, weighing whether to confess or keep up the act. Finally, she turned on her heel and walked away. "Forget it," she muttered. "I'm not doing this with you." It wasn't a denial, and it wasn't an answer. It was an escape, and that told me everything I needed to know. For the next few days, I tried to piece together what was happening. Emily acted like nothing had happened. chatting casually about the kids, work, and weekend plans. But there was an edge to her, a brittleness that hadn't been there before. Every time I brought up the condoms, she'd deflect or shut me down completely. Meanwhile, I started paying closer attention. Her phone, always within arm's reach, was now glued to her hand. She'd step outside for calls she needed privacy for, which was new. And twice, I noticed her coming home late without a good explanation. Each time, she had an excuse: a meeting ran late, traffic was bad, but her eyes wouldn't quite meet mine when she said it. I decided I needed answers, but I wasn't going to get them from Emily. That's when I remembered her car. We'd bought it together last year, and she loved it. But Emily, like most people, wasn't great at keeping it spotless. I knew she wouldn't think to hide anything there. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I grabbed her keys and headed out. The car looked normal: empty coffee cups in the cup holder, a yoga mat in the back seat, but when I opened the glove compartment, my breath caught. Inside was a receipt from a hotel in the next town over, dated just 2 weeks earlier. The name on the bill wasn't hers. It was Alex Davidson's. Alex was someone I'd met only once or twice at company events, a younger guy from her office who'd always seemed harmless. Quiet, polite, the kind of guy who blended into the background. I stared at the receipt, the room number printed neatly at the top, and felt my stomach drop. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe it was an office event, and they'd been booking rooms for employees. But deep down, I knew better. I tucked the receipt back where I'd found it, careful to leave everything as it was. When I went back inside, Emily was in the kitchen, sipping coffee like it was just another day. She smiled when she saw me. "Morning," she said, as if the word didn't weigh 1,000 pounds. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady. "What's on your agenda today?" She rattled off a list of errands, none of which included a trip to a hotel. I nodded, playing along, and kissed her on the cheek before heading to work. That evening, I called Alex. His number was easy to find in the company directory. When he picked up, I didn't bother with pleasantries. "This is Jason, Emily's husband," I said. "We need to talk." There was a long pause. Then, a shaky, nervous voice replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," I snapped. "I have the receipt." Silence. "I'm giving you one chance to tell me the truth," I said. "Because if you don't, I'm going to make your life very difficult." That got him talking. The words spilled out, each one like a knife: how it started at the office, how they'd been spending time together, how it wasn't serious. He sounded pathetic, stumbling over himself, apologizing like that would make it better. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone, trying to process what I'd just heard. Part of me wanted to storm into the kitchen and confront Emily right then and there. But another part of me, the part that felt utterly shattered, knew I needed a plan. I sat in the car for hours that night, staring at the dashboard, trying to figure out how to approach this. Rage boiled inside me, but it wasn't the kind of anger you scream about. It was a cold, calculated fury, the kind that tells you this moment is pivotal, the kind you can't afford to mess up. When I finally walked back into the house, Emily was on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up at me and smiled like nothing was wrong. That smile made me want to snap the phone in half. "Hey, you're late," she said casually. "Long day?" "Yeah," I said, my tone unreadable. "We need to talk." Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. I didn't wait for a response. I walked to the kitchen, pulled out the hotel receipt I'd taken from her car, and placed it on the table. "What's this?" I asked, staring at her. She didn't look at the paper right away. She looked at me, her face carefully blank. "What do you mean?" I tapped the receipt. "This. From the Grand Vista Hotel. With Alex Davidson's name on it." Her eyes flicked to the paper, then back to me, and for a split second, I saw it, the panic she couldn't quite hide. But Emily was quick. Too quick. "Jason, this is ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp now. "I don't know why you're even bringing this up."
It's nothing. Nothing?
I said, my voice low but steady.
Because I talked to Alex. He didn't think it was nothing.
That hit her like a slap. Her mouth opened slightly, and her face drained of color. She looked like she was scrambling for something to say, but I didn't give her the chance.
Don't bother lying, I continued. I know everything. The hotel, the affair, all of it.
Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Jason, you have no idea what you're talking about, she said, her voice trembling now.
Whatever Alex told you, he's lying. Is that really the story you're going with? I said, incredulous. You're going to sit there and tell me that Alex made all this up? That the hotel magically put his name on the receipt? That you have nothing to do with him? She didn't answer.
Instead, she crossed her arms, her eyes blazing.
You've been spying on me, haven't you? Going through my things, digging into my life.
That's the real problem here, Jason.
You don't trust me. I laughed an ugly, bitter laugh that even surprised me. You're seriously going to turn this around on me? After everything? After the condoms, the late nights, the lies? And now this? Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might finally tell the truth. But instead, she doubled down. Fine, she snapped. Yes, I went to the hotel. But it wasn't what you think. Alex needed help with a work presentation, and we stayed late. That's it. That's it? I echoed, my voice rising now. You think I'm stupid enough to believe that? Do you even hear yourself?
She stood abruptly, knocking her phone off the couch.
What do you want me to say, Jason? Do you want me to admit to something I didn't do? Is that what this is about?
I stepped closer, my hands clenched at my sides.
I want the truth, Emily. For once. Just tell me the damn truth. Her defiance crumbled in an instant.
She slumped back onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper.
It wasn't supposed to happen, she said. It just got out of hand. I froze.
I'd prepared myself for anger, for lies, for more excuses. But hearing her admit it, hearing her say the words, still felt like a punch to the gut.
How long? I asked, my voice cold and flat. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, it was so quiet I almost didn't hear her.
6 months, she said.
6 months. Half a year.
Longer than I would have guessed, but not surprising. Suddenly, so many things made sense, the late nights, the distance, the condoms.
All of it clicked into place, and it made me feel sick. Why? I asked, my voice shaking now. Why would you do this to us? To me? To the kids?
She looked up at me, her eyes red and filled with tears.
I don't know, she said. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was lonely, Jason. You've been so distant lately, and I felt like you didn't care anymore.
I stared at her in disbelief.
You're blaming me? I'm not blaming you, she said quickly. I'm just saying. I didn't feel like we were connected anymore. And Alex, he was just there. He listened. He made me feel.
Don't, I said sharply. Don't you dare finish that sentence.
She flinched but didn't look away.
I'm sorry, she said.
I'm so sorry. For the first time that night, I felt my anger give way to something else. Something heavier. Sorry doesn't fix this, Emily. It doesn't undo what you've done.
I know, she whispered. The room was silent for a long time after that. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustle of the curtains in the breeze. It was surreal, standing there, looking at the woman I'd built my life with and realizing she wasn't who I thought she was.
Finally, I spoke again. I need you to leave, I said.
Her head snapped up.
Jason, please.
No, I said firmly.
You don't get to beg now. Pack a bag and go. I don't care where. Just leave. She hesitated, her face crumpling like she was about to argue. But then she saw the look in my eyes and realized I wasn't giving her a choice. Without another word, she stood and walked to the bedroom. I stayed in the kitchen, listening to the sounds of her packing, trying to keep myself together. When she finally left, she didn't say goodbye. She just closed the door behind her, and the house fell silent again. I sat in the silence for what felt like hours, staring at the empty doorway where Emily had left. My chest felt hollow, but my mind was sharp, calculating, focused, and utterly ruthless. She thought her apology would suffice, that saying I'm sorry would patch over half a year of deceit. But she hadn't just betrayed me. She'd made a fool out of me. I wasn't going to let that stand. The first thing I did was retrieve her phone. She'd left it on the couch, probably in her rush to pack. For years, I'd respected her privacy, but after what she'd done, I felt no such obligation. I unlocked it using the passcode I guessed months ago when I started noticing her odd behavior. The messages were there, every disgusting, incriminating word she and Alex had shared. Most were on a separate messaging app, one I didn't even know she used. There were photos, too. I saved them all, copying everything to a secure folder on my laptop. If Emily thought this would remain between us, she was dead wrong. Next, I reached out to Alex. Not directly, no, I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of another phone call. Instead, I emailed every piece of evidence to his work email address, using a new account I created just for this purpose. I made sure the subject line was clear, for HR and management review. Alex wasn't just a random coworker. He was a supervisor at Emily's company, and their affair had violated not only my trust but also their workplace's strict code of conduct. Their emails and texts made it clear that they'd carried out their relationship on company time and property, something any HR department would take seriously. I attached everything to the email and included a note. These messages and photos were discovered during a personal matter. Both Alex Davidson and Emily Walker have engaged in misconduct that violates workplace policies. Please take appropriate action. I sent the email and leaned back, feeling a grim satisfaction. That wasn't enough, though. Not yet. Emily had humiliated me, dragged me through the mud without a second thought, and I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. The next step required careful planning. I spent the rest of the night making calls, starting with my lawyer. I explained the situation, making sure to emphasize Emily's betrayal and the impact it had on our family. The lawyer didn't mince words. If you want to proceed, you'll need to document everything. Financial records, communications, anything that can show how her actions have affected you and the kids. I already had the communications, and I knew where to start with the financials. Emily and I shared an account, but she'd always been the one to handle it. I logged in and began combing through every transaction. It didn't take long to find the evidence I was looking for: hotel charges, expensive dinners, even gifts that had been purchased under the guise of work expenses. By the time I was done, I had a spreadsheet detailing every dollar she'd spent on her affair. I forwarded it to my lawyer along with the messages and photos. Make sure this gets included in the divorce proceedings, I wrote. I want her to account for every cent. That wasn't all, though. Emily's parents were deeply conservative, the kind of people who valued family above all else. They'd always treated me like a son, and I knew they'd be devastated to learn what she'd done. I drafted a carefully worded email, attaching a few select screenshots of her conversations with Alex, not the explicit ones, just enough to drive the point home. Subject: something you need to know about Emily. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Harper, I'm writing to you because I feel you deserve to know the truth about what's been happening. Emily has been unfaithful, and her actions have deeply hurt me and the kids. Attached, you'll find evidence of her affair. I didn't want to involve you, but given the circumstances, I thought it was only fair to let you know. I hesitated for a moment before hitting send. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about making sure everyone saw Emily for who she really was. By morning, my phone was buzzing with calls and messages. The first was from her father. He sounded devastated, his voice heavy with disbelief as he asked for more details.
I told him everything, sparing no detail. By the end of the call, he promised to speak with Emily, though his tone suggested he already knew it wouldn't change anything.
The second call was from Alex. I didn't answer.
His voicemail was predictable, pleading, apologizing, begging me to please reconsider. I deleted it without listening to the rest.
Then came the email from Emily's HR department.
They thanked me for bringing the matter to their attention and confirmed they'd opened an internal investigation. The satisfaction I felt reading that email was the first real emotion I'd had since this nightmare began. But the real blow came later that evening, when Emily herself showed up at the house.
I didn't let her in.
She stood on the porch, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to talk to her. "You ruined my life, Jason," she shouted through the door.
"Do you know what you've done?"
I opened the door just enough to look her in the eye.
"I didn't ruin your life, Emily," I said coldly. "You did that all on your own."
Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. For the first time since this all began, I felt like I was in control. She had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences.
Before she could say anything else, I closed the door and locked it. The days that followed Emily's breakdown on my porch were surreal.
The house felt emptier than ever, not just because she wasn't there, but because the life we'd built together now felt like a hollow shell. The kids were staying with my sister temporarily. I didn't want them around the fallout, and honestly, I needed the space to think.
Emily tried to contact me constantly.
Calls, texts, emails every day. There was another desperate attempt to explain, to apologize, to fix what she had broken. I ignored most of them, only responding when it involved logistics. I wasn't interested in her excuses. I needed clarity, and I wasn't going to find it in her words.
My lawyer updated me on the divorce proceedings.
Emily had been served with papers, and her reaction, according to him, had been predictably dramatic. She'd asked for mediation, pleading for a chance to make things right.
I declined. Mediation wasn't going to bring back the months of lies, the humiliation, the betrayal. It was time to move forward.
But before I could truly close this chapter, there was one thing left to do, a final conversation.
I wasn't doing it for her.
I was doing it for myself, to put everything out in the open and make it clear that there was no coming back from this. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown, somewhere neutral. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea. She looked smaller than I remembered, almost fragile, but I refused to let that sway me. She'd made her choices, and now she had to face them. "Jason," she said as I sat down. Her voice was soft, trembling.
"Thank you for meeting me."
I didn't respond right away, just leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms.
"Say what you need to say."
She flinched slightly at my tone but nodded.
"I know I've hurt you. I know I've ruined everything. And I'm sorry, more sorry than I can put into words."
"Sorry for what, exactly?" I asked, my voice flat. "Sorry for cheating?
For lying? For dragging me through the mud while you played house with Alex?"
Her face crumpled, and tears welled in her eyes. "For all of it," she whispered. "I don't know what I was thinking, Jason."
"I wasn't thinking.
I was stupid and selfish, and I let things get so far out of hand that I didn't know how to stop."
"You didn't know how to stop?"
I repeated, anger rising in my chest.
"You could have stopped by not starting in the first place. You could have stopped every single time you walked into that hotel room or answered his texts. Don't sit here and tell me you didn't have a choice."
Her tears fell freely now, and she reached across the table as if to take my hand. I pulled back, and the look on her face was almost enough to make me feel guilty.
"Almost."
"I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But Jason, I still love you."
"I never stopped loving you."
"I know that doesn't fix anything, but it's the truth." I laughed, a short, bitter sound that felt foreign coming from me.
"You love me?
Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night?
Because if this is love, Emily, I'd hate to see what you do to people you don't care about."
She winced, but I pressed on.
Do you even understand what you've done? You didn't just cheat on me. You blew up our family. The kids, have you thought about what this is going to do to them? What kind of example you've set? Her sobs grew louder, and the people around us began to glance in our direction. I didn't care. Let them look. Let them see what happens when someone destroys everything they claim to care about. I'll do anything, she said finally. Anything to fix this. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want. Just give me a chance to prove that I can change. Her desperation was palpable, but it only made me angrier. Change? I repeated. You think this is about change? Emily, this isn't some bad habit you can just quit. This is who you are, someone who lies, who cheats, who puts her own selfish desires above her family. And I don't want any part of it anymore. Her sobs turned into a quiet, shaking silence, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. Is there really no hope? She asked, her voice barely audible. No, I said firmly. There isn't. I've already filed for divorce. I've already moved on. The only thing left to do is figure out how to make this as painless as possible for the kids. Her face crumpled again, and I could see the weight of my words sinking in. But I didn't feel any satisfaction. Just a dull, empty ache where love used to be. I'll always regret this, she said after a long pause. Losing you. Losing everything. That's on you, I said, standing up. You lost me the moment you decided I wasn't enough. And you're going to have to live with that. I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her behind. The air outside was cold, biting against my skin, but it felt like a relief after the suffocating tension of that conversation. As I got into my car and drove away, I felt a strange sense of finality. It wasn't closure, not entirely, but it was enough. Enough to start rebuilding. Enough to move forward. The drive home was quiet, not just in sound but in how it felt, an absence of chaos, shouting, or desperate pleas. It was a kind of quiet I hadn't experienced in weeks. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I realized something. I didn't feel the crushing weight I had been carrying since this nightmare began. The anger, the sadness, even the raw betrayal, all of it had dulled into something manageable. Emily was out of my life. Maybe not entirely, since we had the kids, but the part of her that had taken up space in my soul, the part one used to love, was gone. And I was okay with that. Inside, the house was the same as ever, clean but lived in, our family photos still hanging on the walls, the faint smell of the coffee I'd brewed that morning lingering in the air. Yet, it felt different. It was mine now, truly mine, without the pretense of a shared life. I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, staring at nothing in particular. My phone buzzed a few times, but I ignored it. I knew who it was. Emily, probably, or maybe her parents, calling to try and mediate. I wasn't interested. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and logistics. My lawyer and hers went back and forth, hammering out details about custody, finances, and who would get what. I made it clear from the start that I wasn't interested in revenge, at least, not at the expense of our kids. The evidence I'd gathered was enough to ensure I wouldn't be taken advantage of, but beyond that, I didn't care about punishing her anymore. The kids were the hardest part. Explaining everything to them without making it sound like a total disaster took every ounce of strength I had. My daughter, the older one, took it in stride, though I could see the cracks in her composure. My son didn't hide his anger as well. Why would she do this, he'd asked one night, his voice shaking with frustration. I didn't have an answer for him. Not a good one, anyway. She made a mistake, I said carefully. A terrible mistake. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. She doesn't love you, he shot back, his voice full of bitterness. That's not your concern, I said gently but firmly. This is between me and her. You don't have to pick sides. He didn't respond, just looked down at his hands, his jaw clenched tight. I wanted to hug him, to fix it somehow, but I knew there was no fixing this. All I could do was be there for him, for both of them, and hope they'd come out of this okay.
Emily tried to reach out a few times after our final meeting. The messages were always the same: pleas for forgiveness, promises to change, and more apologies than I could count.
I didn't respond.
I didn't block her either. I figured it was better for her to vent her guilt at me than to burden the kids with it.
Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my life.
I started running again, something I hadn't done in years. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and even mentoring a few younger colleagues. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd drifted away from during the years I'd been so consumed by my marriage and family life.
One evening, a friend convinced me to join a local group for divorced parents.
It wasn't my usual scene. I'm not the type to sit in a circle and share my feelings, but something about it felt right.
The people there weren't trying to fix me or offer solutions.
They were just there, sharing their own stories, their own struggles, and their own small victories. It helped more than I expected. By the time the divorce was finalized, I felt like I was standing on solid ground again. I kept the house, partly because it was practical and partly because I wanted the kids to have a sense of stability.
Emily moved into a small apartment across town.
She didn't fight me on custody, agreeing to a schedule that worked for everyone. The first time the kids stayed with her for the weekend, I felt a pang of something: loneliness, maybe, or nostalgia. But it passed quickly. I spent the time cleaning, reading, and catching up on things I'd put off for far too long. One day, I got a call from Emily's father. He'd been one of the few people in her family who hadn't tried to defend her actions, and for that, I respected him. "How are you holding up?" he asked.
"Better," I said honestly.
"Good," he said. "You deserve better than what she gave you, Jason."
"I hope you know that."
"I do," I replied.
"But I'm not angry anymore. I just want to move on." And I meant it.
A few months later, I took the kids on a trip to the mountains, just the three of us. It wasn't extravagant, just a simple cabin with hiking trails and a lake nearby.
But it was exactly what we needed.
We laughed, we talked, we reconnected in a way we hadn't in a long time.
Sitting by the campfire one night, my daughter turned to me and said, "Dad, are you happy?"
It was a simple question, but it stopped me in my tracks.
Was I happy? Not entirely, not yet. But I was getting there.
"I'm getting there," I told her. She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it. Emily and I never really spoke again beyond the necessary exchanges about the kids. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd quit her job and was trying to rebuild her life, too. I wished her well from a distance but didn't dwell on it. My focus was on the future, on my kids, my work, and the life I was slowly piecing back together.
The scars of betrayal didn't fade overnight, and maybe they never would. But they didn't define me anymore.
I wasn't just the man whose wife cheated on him. I was Jason, a father, a friend, a man moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, I was okay with that.